Scrooge has been shown his past, and the way his avarice and greed has shaped his life around himself. Now for the second spirit, where he sees how his way of life has affected those around him now. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Read by Karl. Part 2. Stave 3, the second of the three spirits. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told the bell was once again upon the stroke of 1. He felt he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for the special purpose of holding converse with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to which of his curtains the new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and lying down again, established a sharp lookout all round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on moments of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express the widest ranges of capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not, by any means, prepared for nothing. And consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive it might be at that very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last hour he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always a person not in a predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and one in quest may have done it too, at last, I say, he began to think the source and secret of ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it seemed to shine. The idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was upon the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked like a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many lunar mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch, there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet him. "I am the ghost of Christmas presents," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green globe, or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if intending to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free, Freeze its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded around his middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have not seen the like of me before," explained the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. "Has never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my older brothers, born these later years," pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800, said the ghost. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night at compulsion. I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkey, geese, game vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood on the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, for the tops of their houses, where it was mad delight to the boys to see it came pumping down to the road below, and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, with the dirty snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been plowed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace on the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy. The shore streets were cloaked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, with heavier particles thinner than a shower of sooty atoms, as all the chimneys of Great Britain had by one consent caught fire and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate of the town, yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shoveling away on the rooftops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily as if it went right and not less heartily if it went wrong. The upholsterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped on the waistcoats of jovial gentlemen, lolling at the doors, tumbling out in the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girth Spanish onions, slanting in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, looking for their shells and watching slyness of the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks. The people's mouths might water glass as they passed. There were files of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their radiance ancient walks among the woods, and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squat and swarthy, selling off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of the juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant blended race, appeared to know what there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping round around the little world in slow and passionless excitement. The grocers, nearly closed, or perhaps two shutters down or one, but through those gapes such glimpses was not, although the scales descending on the ground were as merry sound, twine and roller part company so briskly, though the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scent of tea and coffee was so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruit so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes. But everything was good to eat in its Christmas dress. But the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day, they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left the purchase upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh, the polished hearts with which they fashioned their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection, and for Christmas daws to peck at as they were close. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. At the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings, innumerable people carrying the dinners to the baker shops. The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, taking off the covers of the bearers past, sprinkling incense on their dinners from his torch. It was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice when there were angry words, between some dinner carriers who would jostle each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and there was a general shadowing forth of all those dinners, and the progress of their cooking, and the thawed watch of wet above his baker's oven, when the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. "Is there a peculiar flavour in what you sparkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is, my own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given. To a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because it needs it most." "Spirit," said Scrooge for a moment's thought, "I wondered you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these innocent people's opportunities of innocence of enjoyment." "I?" cried the Spirit. "You would deprive them of the means of dining every 7th day, often the only day in which they can be said to dine at all," said Scrooge. "Wouldn't you?" "I?" cried the Spirit. "You seek those closest places on the 7th day," said Scrooge, "and it comes to the same thing." "I seek?" explained the Spirit. "Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least that of your family," said Scrooge. "There are those upon this earth of yours," returned the Spirit, "who lay claim to know us, and those who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that. Charge their doings upon yourselves, not us." Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible, as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully, and like a supernatural creature, as it were possible he could have done in any lofty hall. Perhaps it was the pleasure the good Spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, a generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe. On the threshold of the door, the Spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkle of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays with 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas presents blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6pence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting in the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon the son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show him his linen in the fashionable parts. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and learned it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbled up, knocking loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha wasn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said the girl, appearing as she spoke. "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are! said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind so long as you're come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless thee." No, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonal, and with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming?" said Bob, with a sudden declension in his spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came up prematurely from behind the closet and ran to his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in of the copper. "How did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple. It might be pleasant to them to remember on Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told of this, and trembled more when he said Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to a stool before the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, their kit were being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture and gel with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, which with they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued, you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feather phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him on a tiny corner of the table. The two Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounted guard upon their post, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for geese before their term came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit looked slowly all on the carving knife, prepared to plunge into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat upon the table with the hand of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There was never such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't eaten it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage to the eyebrows. But now the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break and turn out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall in the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello! A great cloud of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and the pastry cooks next door to each other, with the laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quarter of ignited brandy and benighted with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, what a wonderful pudding!" Bob Cratchit said, and calmly, too, that he regarded as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind. She would confess she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Annie Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. Unless the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound and jug being tasted, considered perfect, apples and oranges were put on the tiny table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half of one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done. Bob threw it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "was interesting and never felt before. Tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. These shadows remain unaltered by the future. The child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then, if he be like to die, he better do it. Decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect and the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I gave him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children. Christmas Day." "Should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake and the day," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of the proceedings which had no heartiness. The Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care tuppence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow upon the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, for the mere relief of Scrooge the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told me how a situation aside from Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie in bed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Also, she had seen Countess and the Lord some days before, how the Lord was much about as tall as Peter, in which Peter pulled up his collar so high you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and jug went round and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. And Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the brighter sprinklings of the Spirit's torch passing, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially upon Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark, and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire and deep red curtains, ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There the children in the house were running up the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, all clattering at once, tripped lightly off to some neighbor's house, where, well upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches, well they knew it, in a glow. We would judge from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings. You might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high. Blessings on it, how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breast and opened its capacious palm and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand, its bright and harmless morsel and everything within its reach. There was already a lamplighter around and before, dawning the dusky street with specks of light, who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the Spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter to get any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it was the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed. It would have done so, but for the frost that held its prisoner. Nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down the west the setting sun left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning, lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth," returned the Spirit. "But they know me. See!" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy. From time to time they all joined on the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud. And so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The Spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped whither not to see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, the frightful range of rocks behind him, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of waters that rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns that had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind one might suppose, the seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it like the waves they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire, that through the loophole in the thick stone shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining horny hands on the rough table on which they sat, they missed each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder two, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be struck upon a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on, until, being far away, as he told Scrooge from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout on the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, walking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day than any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities. and remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secret as profound as death itself. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear him a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize as his own nephews, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha! If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in the laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It's a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there was infection, disease, and sorrow, there was nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor." When Scrooge's nephew laughed in his way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face in most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he. Their assembled friends, being not a bit behind, roared out lustily. "He cried that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too." More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Breastless women never do anything by halves. They're always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pairs of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would call provoking, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew, "but that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he's very rich," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you've always told me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is no use to him. He won't do any good with it. He doesn't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking he's ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here it takes it to his head to dislike us. He wouldn't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He didn't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Bill said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, with the dessert upon the table, were clustered around the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I have great faith in these young newlywed housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace, Tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. "Do go on, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finished his speech, begins to say, "He is such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it wasn't possible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. "Was all I'm going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "the consequence of his taking no dislike to us, and not making merry with us, as I think, is he loses some pleasant moments which would do him no harm. I am sure he loses of pleasant companions he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean, they give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him, if he finds me going there in good temper year after year, saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' It only puts him on the vein to leave his poor clerk 50 pounds. That's something. I think I shook him yesterday." It was their turn to laugh now at the motion of his shaking Scrooge. But being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch. I can assure you, especially Topper, could growl away in the base like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece fell well upon the harp, and playing among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who had fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When the strain of music sounded, all the things the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of his wife for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits. For it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop. There wasn't first a game at Blind Man's Bluff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Tupper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the waste tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Ducking on the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, swirling himself among the curtains wherever he went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anyone else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been a affront to your understanding, would instantly have settled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of all her silken rustlings and rapid flutterings past him, he got her in a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it when another blind man being office, they were so confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's block party. It was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined the forfeits and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great. And to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Hopper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting the interest he had in what was going on, his voice made no sound in their ears. He somehow came up with his guesses quite loud, and very often guessed quite right too. For the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel, warranted not the cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. Here's a new game, said Scrooge. Only 1/2 hour, spirit, only one. It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answered to the questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning about which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable one, a savage, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes and lived in London, walked about the streets. It wasn't made a show of, it wasn't lived at anybody, it didn't live in a menagerie, was never killed in the market, was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, his nephew burst out in a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexplicably tickled he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I found it! I know what it is, Fred! I know where it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. Insomuch an answer in the negative was sufficient to divert their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they never had any tendency that way. "He's given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred. "It would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to your hand in a moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge!" "Well, Uncle Scrooge!" they cried. "And a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year," said the old man, whatever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. He wouldn't take it from me, but may have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay, light of heart, that he would have pledged the unconscious company in turn, and thanked them in an inaudible speech, if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off on the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were once again upon their travels. Much they saw and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient and a greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail. In misery's every refuge, where vain man's little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because his crystal solitude appeared to be condensed in the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it, till they left children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was grey. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," cried the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing nearer." The chimes were rumbling the 3/4 past 11 at that moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intensely at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself returning from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." For the folding of his robe had brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung upon the outside of his garment. "Oh, man, look here. Look, down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl. Yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with his freshish tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them, and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade, throughout all the mysteries of wonderful creation, as monsters half so terrible and dread. Scrooge started back appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves, rather than be party to such a lie of enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, in all their degree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." "Deny it," cried the spirit, stretching out his hand towards the city. "Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your factious purchase, and make it worst, and bide the end." "Have they no refuge or recourse?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a sullen phantom, draped and hooded, coming, like a mist along the ground, towards him. To be continued.